Are we ready? This story begins and ends with this door glass. It is the glass that belonged to my grandfather, Ernest Robert Warren, a lawyer who practiced 50 years in Gastonia, North Carolina. I doubt he ever imagined that this glass, his shingle if you will, would find a home in Midtown Atlanta on the 44th floor of the firm of Alston and Bird, where today his great-grandson practices law. This film is a tribute to Mr. Warren, to his stories, to his mischief-making and merriment, to his goodness, as told by those who knew him and saw him do what he loved the most, practice law.
You know, the earliest memories of my grandfather was he was bigger than life. And in addition to my parents living at 319 South York Street, my Aunt Lou Fuller lived there as well until she was married in 1956. I was born in 1952. And, you know, as a young person, I just have really happy memories of being in the household. My Aunt Lou, between my Aunt Lou and my grandfather and my parents, I was obviously very spoiled. I had a lot of attention. I should mention that he was a widower. Our grandmother, Alice Warren, died during the flu epidemic during World War II. And so he raised three daughters, for the most part by himself, along with some domestic help that were really part of our family.
The first recollection I have of him is his coming up to the second floor in that old First Federal building. I think Julius had invited him to come by to meet me because I was just moving into the office. And he came in, and I remember being so impressed by the stature he had. He was the best-dressed lawyer in town. He looked like a lawyer in the great American tradition. He wore great clothes, all of which I assume were purchased at Warren Gardner's, who was distant kin to him. And he wore those hard-worsted wool suits with vests and a chain and a rosebud in his lapel. And he was a handsome man. Even though by that time he was in his late 60s, he was still a very fine-looking man, and he had a great presence about him. He was the kind of person you were drawn to when he walked into a room, and he was certainly the kind of lawyer you were drawn to when he walked into a courtroom.
My father was sheriff, and so I used to hang around. I used to hang around the jail after school. We'd go to Sweetland's restaurant, and then I'd hang around there, and I'd always see Mr. Warren walking. He never let it pass that he didn't wave to me and come tell me a story. So I always remember my visual memory of Mr. Warren was a big man, tall man, had a big nose, had a big jowls, and he always wore a three-piece suit. I think maybe summer and winter, probably not summer, but my memory of him is in a three-piece wool suit, kind of unusual. And of course, he always had a red rosebud in his lapel every day. I never remember seeing him without the red rose in his lapel.
my main connection with Mr. Warren was through my partner, my very senior partner, Julius Sanders. They were best of friends. As far as I know, they were best friends. And I knew Mr. Warren through Julius Sanders. And a few things I remember, Mr. Warren, as you know, and as probably somebody's already said, he always wore this little rose in his pocket, in his lapel, a little red rose. And that's what I remember about when I saw him. He always had that with him. I felt like that he wanted to be known for that. Like if somebody were looking for this particular lawyer, they would say, oh, he's the one that wore the red rose. I just feel like he probably liked that.
And he was always, I don't recall ever seeing him with anything other than a suit on or a red smoking jacket. One of the greatest presents he ever got was from Aunt Lou and Aunt Carolyn Sumner. And they had a rose, a fresh red rose, delivered to our house at 319 South York Street every week. And he would put that rose on in the morning and work and come home at night and put it back into a glass in the refrigerator. And I recall him saying that it was one of the best presents he ever got in his life. You know, and we had rose bushes at our property, which he took care of himself personally. And so we had plenty of roses 6 months out of the year, but the other 6 months of the year, he didn't. And I recall that always brought a smile to his face. And God help you if you did anything with that rose in the refrigerator.
And I know one of the great memories I have is his asking me to join with him and appear as co-counsel in a case he had before the Supreme Court. And I did the research on that case. It was not a great case to appeal, frankly, but we did the best we could with it. And I prepared the brief and the case on appeal and all of that. And we went to Raleigh together to present that case to the Supreme Court. And he drove me up in his big car, his big sedan, and we stayed at the Sir Walter Hotel. I had a room and he had a room. We went down stairs that evening to the Sir Walter, and we had a couple of drinks. And I remember him telling me distinctly, now we're going to go down and have a drink, but we're not going to have more than 2 drinks. That's the most we can have when we come to Raleigh and have a case before the Supreme Court. He had taken me by the Supreme Court offices that afternoon and introduced me to several of the justices of the Supreme Court. He knew them all. They knew him. And so the next day we appeared before the Supreme Court. We presented that case, and it was just almost a joyful experience for me to be in the presence of a man who was considered the dean of the Gaston County Bar and who knew so much about the history of Gaston County.
Back then, the bar meetings were in Cleveland one month, Shelby, and then Lincolnton another month, and then Gastonia. Well, when we went to those 2 counties, I was the chauffeur. Mr. Warren and Julius Sanders sat in the back seat of the car together, and I sat in the front by myself. I felt like I should have had a chauffeur's hat on, but they talked and had a big time.
He was the leading trial lawyer in Gastonia, and he knew it, and everybody else knew it. He had a sort of a presence about him that said, this is a man that you want on your side.
I don't recall the year of the age when my grandfather told me this, but I recall one day being in his car. It was a Chrysler Newport, a big black Chrysler Newport. And I recall that I think we might have been stopped somewhere. Maybe he used to go Sunday mornings and get a newspaper across to the post office in Gastonia and check his mail. And I think we were sitting there, and I was, at that time I called him Granddaddy, I believe, just as a memory that I have. But he said to me, he said, Skip, you know, I'm a lawyer. And since I'm a lawyer and you're my grandson, why don't you just call me partner, like we're partners in a law firm. So I thought that was pretty cute. I never really understood it, but that's what I called him. I always called him partner, and it was an interesting thing. I don't know whether it was because he didn't want people to know that I was his grandson or he had grandkids or what, but we had a lot of fun. It was sort of our own secret thing. He told me, he said, Ernest and Rob, that's Ernest Sumner and Rob Sumner, my first cousins who were like brothers to me. He said, they call me Papa, so you call me partner.
On Monday mornings when all the lawyers would meet, and they would call out these cases, and every lawyer in town would be there, and he was always there. They said that if Mr. Warren or Pat Cook weren't there, you couldn't have court that week because they had most of the cases.
By that time, of course, he only had about 7 years to live when I first met him in 1962. So I was seeing him at a time when his best years practicing law maybe were behind him. He had become very selective about the cases that he took, and he could refer cases to a lot of other lawyers. It's one of the reasons I think he was so beloved, because he was very good about that and helpful, particularly to young lawyers. But in court, he was not a show-off. He had that quiet dignity about him that you like to see with a senior lawyer in a courtroom. And he was very quiet and deliberative about the kind of questions he would ask witnesses on the stand. And I've always thought one of the reasons for that was he knew absolutely every judge in North Carolina, and he knew them well. And he probably had a lot to do with their being appointed judges, because they were all appointed then, of course. And so when the judges would come to Gaston County to hold court, he knew them all, and would have lunch with them, and sometimes would invite me to come along.
He was a guy who had a prodigious memory, almost a total recall of facts. It's rumored to me, I didn't see it, that he tried a murder case one time with his notes on the back of a matchbook. I don't know if that's true, probably an apocryphal story, but it could have been.
I think in court, he liked to say things that might have not been expected by the other lawyer. I mean, he had ways of maybe surprising the other lawyer. He had a case that it was against a car company, and Detroit sent all these 2 or 3 expert witnesses from Detroit. And during the trial of the case, they made a big deal about expert witness, and we were qualified as an expert witness, and they just threw that in. So the case was tried, and when they were arguing, this is what I meant about Mr. Warren would kind of like to say things that might have shocked or surprised or whatever. So Mr. Warren was arguing to the jury, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a lot today about expert witnesses of the testimony." He said, "But really nobody's told you what an expert witness is. Let me just define it for you. An expert witness is an educated SOB a long ways from home." And the court just broke up. That's what he did. I've seen him do that so much.
But one thing that he did come to love on television was professional wrestling. And every Saturday afternoon, he would watch professional wrestling. And if you were there with him in the den watching him, he would move with every wrestling move. I mean, he loved it. Of course, even at a young age, I knew it was fake, but we still got a big kick out of it. Which brings me to an interesting story. I think I was maybe about 9 or 10, and he told me, he said, "I want you to come with me to court today." And I said, "Well, Granddaddy, I have to go to school." He said, "Get your mom to write you a note. This is going to be something really interesting." And what had happened was that he was going to be representing the manager of a wrestling tag team, and they were not the good tag team. They were the bad tag team. It was the Mass Bolos. And apparently the manager for the Mass Bolos had driven through Gastonia at like 95 miles an hour and had been arrested by the highway patrol, and they took him to jail for reckless driving, excessive speeding. And then somehow he found out that the best lawyer in Gastonia was our grandfather, Ernest Warren. So they bailed him out, and that day he was showing up in court. And people that knew our grandfather knew he liked to pull jokes on people. And what happened in the courtroom, and this had all been arranged with the prosecutor, was my grandfather got up and made a motion in front of the judge, and I recall it, I wasn't thinking in legal terms, but he got up in front of the judge and said, Your Honor, the prosecutor and I have reached an agreement that we're going to have the manager, I can't recall his name, except I know he carried a big cane. He said the prosecuting attorney and the manager are going to have a wrestling match right here in the courtroom, and whoever wins, if the manager wins, he gets off scot-free. If the prosecutor wins, he goes to jail for 90 days. And of course, the judge didn't know anything about this and thought it was hilarious. But that was sort of the nature of our grandfather. He loved to pull jokes on people.
His sense of humor was something that was just almost magical. He smiled a lot. He was not a grouchy kind of person. He seemed to be able to see the humor in almost any kind of situation.
He used to call Carl Stewart Elijah. He said Carl was so good, he was like Elijah. He was going to go to heaven without dying.
He had nicknames for other lawyers, like Julius Sanders was
Tomcat. He called Julius Sanders Tomcat.
He loved all the different lawyers. In fact, he loved them so much that he had a nickname for about everybody. I never knew mine.
Basil Whitener, former congressman and splendid lawyer, was called High Pockets because he was so tall and had high pockets.
But I worked for Jig Garland and Joe Alala, and he called them Garlic and Lollipop. Well, one of his favorites was Pat Cook. Pat was also a leading trial lawyer, and Pat was a man that liked to take a drink and was well known for that. But whenever he had a case in court, he'd be in there talking about the evils of drinking and everything before the jury. So Mr. Warren called him Saint Patrick, and he called him Saint everywhere he went.
There was an occasion when we were kidding about some old shibboleth about the only thing certain in life is death and taxes. And I kidded him back by saying, well, you know, death is not all that certain. Think about Elijah. I mean, he didn't have to go through that. And from that moment on, he was so struck and amused by that he started calling me Elijah. So he would call my office and tell the secretary, let me speak to Elijah. and later on he shortened that to Lige. He would just call and say, let me speak to Lige.
One of his other friends was Julius Sanders. Julius and Carl Stewart practiced together, and Julius was a fine fellow. Mr. Warren really liked him, and he called him TC. And I said, Mr. Warren, why do you call him TC? He said, well, I was looking in the paper the other day and said there was a little want ad from John Cocker's wife, Dotsie. It said, missing, one black and white tomcat, believed to be on romantic mission, answers to the name Julius.
Often would summon me over to his law office if he needed my help, let's say in drafting a particular provision in a will or something like that. I would go over and see his wonderful secretary, Miss Helen, and chat with her a little bit. He would bring me into his office. The telephone would ring, and he would pick up the telephone and say, "All right." He wouldn't say hello. He would say, "All right." And that was the way he answered the telephone.
On many of these Saturday nights when we watched wrestling, we would go to the Elks Club, which was not very far from our home, really sort of around the block. And it's really interesting that later in our life that my first cousin, Rob Sumner, had his law offices in the Elks Club where we used to go have many fun times. And sometimes we would go with my parents, sometimes we would meet the Fullers, sometimes we would meet the Sumners. There was a big giant moose, a big giant elk. And whenever we went there, our grandfather would hold us up so we could touch the fur of the elk. It was a massive thing. And it was a fun place.
So there was a big case going on here. Now, this was before I even thought about law school. I was at Davidson. So Sam and I came to court 2 mornings every week and watched Ernest Warren and Austell Warren. They were together together on this case. And we went every other day to watch Ernest Warren. But he was so highly thought of. He was the North Carolina lawyer as far as we were concerned.
After my grandmother died in World War II, I remember my grandfather telling me he didn't really have much use for church anymore. I recall as a really young child going to the Presbyterian church with him one time, but where he felt that he found God was in the mountains.
If I remember right, when I sold ads for the Spinner Annual, the Gastonia High School Annual, I visited Mr. Warren, and I think his name was on a glass up there, and so
he said, I went up to his law office, which was in what they call the lawyer's building, and still on the door, had one of those old glass door frames with Denny and Warren. Chief Justice Emory Denny was his law partner, but his name was still on the door.
One of the interesting things about our grandfather was that he had a real high sense of integrity, really good judgment, and was always very focused on doing the right thing. As I got older, I started to understand how blessed I was to live with him. As you get a little bit older in life, you recognize that your father, your grandfather are really good people and they do good things, but our grandfather was a really unique individual in the sense that he was probably the most highly respected and one of the most influential people in the town of Gastonia, North Carolina. As I got older and would walk along the street with him, everyone would call him Mr. Warren, everyone knew who he was. If you went into any restaurant or barbershop or bank, they all knew that you were Ernest Warren's grandson. And this applied not only to me, but the Fuller kids and the Sumner kids. And just that association with our grandfather really made us feel good and proud to have a grandfather that was so well thought of in the community.
Look at his pictures when he was a young man, when he was a young lawyer. He was really a fine-looking young lawyer. I would like to have known him during those years. But he was great to me in every way. And as I've often said, I really still miss him.
As he loved the human comedy, and each town had a recorder's court. And in Gastonia, the judge was Oscar Mason. And then he called this man, and he said, Joe Smith, charged with publicly drunk. Oscar Mason looked over and said, I don't believe we know you. Of course, it was the same people that were always up there. And he said, are you from around here? The man said, no, sir. He said, where are you from? He said, I'm from Charlotte. He said, well, how in the world did you get to Gastonia? He said, well, Your Honor, it was like this. He said, I was on my way to Shelby on the bus, and the bus stopped in Gastonia. I got off to get a Coca-Cola, and one thing led to another, and here I am. He said, well, what do you do? Where do you work? He said, I don't work, Your Honor. I have a disability. He said, well, I said, does drinking liquor help your disability? He said, no, Your Honor, but it helps me forget about it. And Mr. Warren stood up and said, Your Honor, this man's telling the damn truth.
He set a standard as a lawyer. He would never take advantage of another lawyer, nor would he ever take advantage of a situation where he might have, had he been just a clever barrister looking for an opening or looking for a way to embarrass the opposition. He would never do that. So he was revered by the bar, and that is what impressed me about him. Had I been asked to write a list of the most highly regarded lawyers in the county or the region at that time, he would simply lead the list easily. And I have always tried to be like him in that respect. He loved being a lawyer. Practicing law was not drudgery to him. He loved going to his law office and staying in that law office. He loved coming down to the courthouse and coming up to where the lawyers gathered, whether or not he had a case to be heard or not, because he loved to mingle with lawyers and judges and not only tell his stories, but listen to them tell theirs. So he was inspirational to me. He would be the kind of lawyer I thought at the time I would like to be.
I must have been 3 or 4 years old. Our Aunt Lou was still living in the home with us. And she was having a very formal bridge lunch. The women were all in day suits with white gloves and hats and crumpets and sandwiches. I'll never forget. I do remember that because I ate a cucumber sandwich and thought it was the worst thing I'd ever eaten in my life. But so that particular day, my grandfather came home from court and he called me in and he said, Skip, he said, I've got a real problem and only you can help me with it. And I said, well, this is before I started calling him partner. I said, well, what is it, Granddaddy? He says, well, I've lost my pig titties. I cannot find them. And he said, I think your Aunt Lou has my pig titties or she knows where they are. And I want you to go into the party and get your Aunt Lou's attention. But you need to say it loud so she can hear you. So I recall going in there. My Aunt Lou she was the 3 sisters, they were all very gracious, but Lou was probably the most proper of them all. And I recall, I will never forget the look on her face, the face of shock, when I said, Aunt Lou, Granddaddy needs his pig titties right away. There were probably 20 women in there at card tables, and people dropped cards, they dropped their drinks. And anyway, my Aunt Lou jumped up, ran me out of the room in there, and went in to say something to my grandfather, but he was faking snoring. I knew he was faking because I could hear him laughing. Anyway, that's one of the things that I recall.